My husband cut off my credit card saying, "Beg for it now." And that was the biggest mistake of his life. I'm Rachel, and what I'm about to tell you is going to show you exactly why you should never underestimate a woman who looks gentle on the outside. Let me take you back to that Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in the checkout line at Whole Foods, my cart full of groceries, when the cashier swiped my card. Declined. She tried again. Still declined. The heat crawled up my neck as the people behind me started shifting impatiently. My hands were shaking when I called the bank right there, and the words I heard made my stomach drop. "Your account has been closed by the primary holder, ma'am." I drove home in a fog, my mind racing. When I walked through the door, Derek was sitting on our leather couch with this smile I'd never seen. It wasn't warm. It wasn't loving. It was cruel. "I cut off all your cards, Rachel," he said, leaning back like he'd just won something. "If you want money now, you're going to have to beg for it." That morning, I'd asked if we could use some of our savings to help my mom with a surgery she needed. He'd exploded, called me a spoiled parasite, said he was tired of funding my princess lifestyle. It didn't make sense. We had money. At least, I thought we'd. "Go on, Rachel. On your knees. Maybe I'll give you an allowance if you're good," he said, loosening his belt as he stretched out. The tears came before I could stop them, but they weren't sad tears. They were rage. I turned around, walked upstairs to the home office, and opened my laptop. What happened next changed everything. This is a long story, and honestly, I'm going to need someone to walk through it with me. If you want to see how this all plays out, and trust me, you do, make sure you're following along here. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next, because what I found on that laptop was something Derek never saw coming. I sat at that desk staring at the screen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Derek thought he'd just put me in my place. He thought I was helpless, dependent, just another wife living off her husband's paycheck. He had no idea who he'd just declared war on. Let me back up a little, because you need to understand how we got here. When I met Derek 5 years ago, I was running my own investment advisory firm. I'd started it at 24 with money I'd saved working 2 jobs through college and a small business loan I'd fought like hell to get. By the time I was 27, I had 15 employees and a client roster that would make most finance bros jealous. Derek was different back then, or at least I thought he was. He was a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm, stable, responsible. He seemed impressed by my success, not threatened by it. He'd show up at my office with coffee, ask about my day, actually listen when I talked about portfolio strategies and market trends. When he proposed, it felt right, safe. I thought I'd found someone who saw me as an equal. About a year into our marriage, a larger holding company approached me with an acquisition offer. The number was life-changing. My lawyer advised me to take it, and I did. I sold the company, but negotiated to keep 40% of the shares. The deal came with a 2-year non-compete clause, which meant I couldn't start another advisory firm during that time. Derek celebrated with me, told me I deserved it, said I could finally relax, maybe take some time to figure out what I wanted to do next. But something shifted after that. Slowly at first. He started making these little comments about how I was home all the time now, and how nice it must be to not have real responsibilities anymore. When I'd spend my days researching new business ideas or taking online courses in financial law, he'd walk by my office and ask if I was playing on the computer again. I brushed it off, told myself he was just stressed from work, that he didn't mean it the way it sounded. Then the comments got sharper. He started talking about our money and my paycheck in this way that made it clear he thought he was the provider now. Never mind that sitting in our joint account was money I'd contributed from my business sale. Never mind that the house we lived in, I'd paid 60% of the down payment. My lawyer had advised me during our engagement to keep my business assets separate. Derek had signed a prenuptial agreement that clearly stated any assets brought into the marriage would remain individual property. I remember him barely glancing at it, joking about how he'd never divorce me anyway, so it didn't matter. He thought the prenup was protecting me in case I ever wanted alimony. He never read the part about how it protected my business accounts and investments from being considered marital property. That Tuesday morning when I asked about helping my mom, something in him snapped. It had been building for months, and I just hadn't wanted to see it. He went on this rant about how I expected him to take care of everyone, how I contributed nothing to our household, how I should be grateful he even kept me around. Words hit me like physical blows. This was the man I'd built a life with, the man who'd promised to be my partner, and now he was sitting downstairs, probably pouring himself a victory drink, thinking he'd finally put his uppity wife in her place. I opened my personal banking portal, the one he didn't know existed. The account I'd set up specifically for my business assets, kept completely separate from my lawyer's instructions. The balance read 4,237, then the 482.67s. My non-compete had ended 6 months ago. I'd been quietly planning my next move, researching, building connections, waiting for the right moment to launch something new. I guess Derek had just given me all the motivation I needed. I picked up my phone and made the first call. My attorney, Margaret, answered on the second ring. I told her everything that had happened. Her response was immediate and calm. She told me she'd have divorce papers ready by morning and asked if I felt safe in the house tonight. That question made something crack open in my chest. Did I feel safe? In my own home? With my own husband? The answer was no, and that realization hurt more than anything Derek had said to me. Margaret told me to document everything, take photos of any joint assets I'd personally purchased, and most importantly, check our joint account transactions from the past year. She said something in her tone that made my stomach tighten. She said controlling men often hide money, and if Derek was this confident about cutting me off, he might have been planning this for a while. I pulled up our joint account, started scrolling through months of statements, grocery shopping, utility bills, his car payment, restaurants, normal stuff. Then I noticed something weird. Every month, like clockwork, there were cash withdrawals, always between $2,000 and $3,000, always on Fridays, always from the same ATM across town near his office. Over 2 years, those withdrawals added up to over $60,000. I sat back in my chair, my mouth dry. Derek was hiding money, building his own secret stash while policing every dollar I might spend. The woman he married, the one who'd built $1 million company from nothing, was about to remind him exactly who he'd underestimated. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I lay in our bed, well, it felt more like his bed now, staring at the ceiling while Derek snored beside me like he didn't have a care in the world. Like he hadn't just tried to financially trap his own wife. My mind was racing. The cash withdrawals, $60,000 over 2 years. Where was it? What was he doing with it? Around 3 a.m, I heard his phone buzz on the nightstand. Once, twice, 3 times. I turned my head slightly and saw the screen light up. A text message preview. I couldn't see the whole thing, but I caught 2 words that made my blood run cold. Friday night. Derek stirred, grabbed his phone, and typed something back. In the darkness, I saw him smile at whatever response he got. Then he put the phone face down and went back to sleep. I waited until his breathing was deep and steady. Then I slipped out of bed and went back to the office. I needed real, undeniable proof of what he was doing. Margaret had been right. Men like this always have something to hide. And if I was going to walk away from this marriage, I wanted to make sure he couldn't paint me as the bad guy. I wanted the truth out in the open where he couldn't spin it. I opened my laptop and did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. His name was Marcus Webb, and his website said he specialized in matrimonial investigations. Infidelity, hidden assets, that sort of thing. I filled out his contact form at 4 a.m, and by 8, he'd already called me back. I told him about the cash withdrawals, the mysterious texts, the way Derek had become more secretive over the past year. Marcus listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he told me he'd seen this pattern 100 times before. He said he could have preliminary findings within a week. I told him he had 3 days. Money wasn't an issue. That morning, I played the role Derek expected. I was quiet at breakfast, didn't ask about the credit cards, didn't bring up the fight. I could feel him watching me, waiting to see if I'd beg like he'd told me to, waiting to see if I'd broken. Instead, I told him I was going to visit my mom, help her around the house while she prepared for her surgery. He seemed pleased with that, said it was good that I was finally being useful. The condescension in his voice made me want to throw my coffee in his face, but I just nodded and grabbed my purse. I didn't go to my mom's house. I went to meet Margaret at her office downtown. She had the divorce papers ready like she'd promised. But she also had something else, a strategy. She told me that if we could prove Derek had been hiding marital assets, we could file for fraudulent dissipation of marital property. It meant he'd not only have to return the money he'd hidden, but the court could also penalize him with additional fines. But we needed proof. Bank statements weren't enough. We needed to know where that money went. That's when Margaret suggested something that made my hands shake. She said if I could access Derek's computer or personal files, anything that showed where he was putting that cash, it would strengthen our case significantly. I knew his laptop password. He'd never changed it since we got married. It was our wedding date. The irony wasn't lost on me. That evening, Derek said he had to work late. He'd been saying that a lot lately, I realized. 2, sometimes 3 nights a week. I told him that was fine. I'd make myself some dinner and probably go to bed early. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I went straight to his home office. His laptop was sitting on the desk, closed. My heart was hammering as I opened it and typed in the password. It worked. I was in. I started with his email, work stuff mostly, client communications, internal memos, nothing unusual. Then I checked his personal email, the one he thought I didn't know about, the one he'd set up years ago and never mentioned. That's where I found them. Hotel confirmations. Dozens of them. Always the same place. A boutique hotel about 30 minutes from our house. Always Friday nights. Going back almost 18 months. My chest felt tight. I clicked on one of the confirmation emails and saw the room was always booked under his name. But it was a king suite, an expensive one. I opened his browser history. He'd been sloppy, hadn't cleared it in weeks. There were searches for restaurants, wine bars, jewelry stores, and then I saw something that made me stop breathing. A jewelry store receipt in his downloads folder, a necklace, white gold with sapphires, purchased 4 months ago, $4,200. I'd never seen that necklace. He'd never given me a necklace. I heard a text notification from his iPad on the bookshelf. He always forgot he had that thing synced to his phone. I walked over and looked at the screen. The message was from a contact saved as JM. It said, "Can't wait for Friday. Wear the thing I like." Below that, an older message from the same contact. "Your wife really doesn't know? You're so bad." And then, a photo. A woman. Blonde, young, probably late 20s. She was wearing a white gold necklace with sapphires, lying in a hotel bed, Derek's hand visible in the frame. I took photos of everything with my phone. The emails, the receipts, the texts, the picture. Then I went one step further. I checked his banking app, which was conveniently set to stay logged in, and there it was. Another account I'd never known about. A savings account at a different bank. Balance, 63 out of 147. Every Friday cash withdrawal deposited right here. His secret fund. I sent everything to Margaret and to Marcus. Then I closed the laptop, put it back exactly how I'd found it, and walked downstairs. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the couch. The same couch where Derek had told me to beg just 24 hours ago. I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't even angry. I was something else entirely. I was calculating. Derek came home around 10 that night. I was still on the couch, the wine glass in my hand nearly empty, the TV playing some show I wasn't actually watching. He walked in, loosened his tie, and looked at me with this expression, like he was checking to see if I'd learned my lesson yet. If I was ready to apologize, to submit, exactly what he expected. I looked down, set my wine glass on the coffee table, and told him I'd been thinking about what he said, that maybe I'd been taking our finances, that I wanted to understand better how our money situation worked. I watched something shift in his face. Satisfaction. He thought he was winning. He sat down next to me, closer than I wanted, and started explaining, no, lecturing, about how hard he worked to support us, how his salary kept the lights on and the mortgage paid, how I needed to be more grateful for the life he provided. I nodded along, asked questions, played the part of the chastened wife who was finally seeing reason. It made me sick, but I needed him comfortable, confident, careless. Then I asked the question I'd been building up to. I told him I wanted to start helping with the bills, maybe get a part-time job or something, just to contribute. I asked if he could show me the budget, help me understand where our money was going each month. His whole body tensed, just for a second, but I saw it. Then he recovered, told me that wasn't necessary, that he had everything under control, said I'd just confuse myself looking at all those numbers, and besides, he'd already set up a system that worked. I pressed a little more, mentioned that I'd noticed we had less in savings than I thought we would, asked if everything was okay with his job. That's when he made his mistake. He got defensive, told me I didn't need to worry about the savings, that he'd moved some money around for better investment opportunities. Said he had an account with higher interest rates that was going to pay off big in a few years. An account. Singular. He'd just confirmed it existed without me even having to accuse him of anything. I played innocent, told him that sounded smart, that I was glad he was thinking ahead for our future. The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but I needed him to believe I was backing down. He relaxed again, even patted my knee like I was a child who'd finally understood a difficult concept. Then he told me he had another late night at the office on Friday. Something about closing out month-end reports for a big Friday. Of course it was Friday. I told him I understood. That work came first. That I'd probably visit my mom that evening anyway. Keep her company before her surgery next week. He seemed to answer. Kissed the top of my head. Something that used to feel affectionate, but now felt like ownership, and went upstairs to shower. The moment I heard the water running, I texted Marcus. Told him Derek would be at the boutique hotel on Friday night, probably around 7 or 8. Asked if he could be there with a camera. His response was immediate. He'd be there. The next 2 days were the longest of my life. I had to pretend everything was normal. Make his coffee in the morning, ask about his day, smile when he came home, all while knowing what he was doing, who he was with, how much he'd stolen from us. Thursday night, Derek mentioned that his Friday meeting might run late, maybe past midnight. Told me not to wait up. I said that was fine, that I'd probably stay overnight at my mom's anyway to help her with some things around the house. Another lie, he was happy. Friday morning, I packed an overnight bag like I was actually going to my mom's. Derek left for work around 8, and the moment his car disappeared down the street, I called a locksmith first. Told him I needed the locks changed on my house that afternoon while my husband was at work. He said he could be there by noon. I gave him my credit card number, not the one Derek had canceled, but one of my own business cards he didn't know existed. Then I called a moving company, told them I needed a team at my house by 2 p.m. They'd have 4 hours to pack and move specific items. Furniture I'd purchased, my clothes, my personal belongings, electronics I'd bought. I sent them a detailed list. Margaret had drawn up the papers. Everything I was taking was either purchased before the marriage or bought with my own money during the marriage. Derek couldn't claim any of it. By 1 p.m., I was sitting in my car down the street, watching my own house. The locksmith arrived at noon, just like he'd promised. By 12:30, I had new keys, and Derek's old keys wouldn't work anymore. At 2 p.m., the moving truck pulled up. I met them at the door and walked them through everything. The couch where Derek had told me to beg, mine. I had the receipt. The dining room table, mine. The bedroom furniture, mine. The TV he loved so much, the one he watched every Sunday during football, mine. A Christmas gift I'd bought him, but purchased with my money, which made it mine to take. They worked fast, professional. By 5 p.m., the house looked completely different, empty in all the ways that mattered. I left 3 things on the bare dining room floor where our table used to be. An envelope, a vase with a single wilted flower, and his old house key, the one that didn't work anymore. Inside the envelope were 3 documents. The divorce petition, filed that morning, a printed screenshot of his secret bank account with the $63,847 balance highlighted, and a photo, not the one of him with the woman in bed. I'd keep that for court, but a printed receipt from the hotel showing a pattern of Friday night bookings going back over a year. I didn't write a note. The documents spoke for themselves. Then I drove to a hotel on the other side of town, not anywhere Derek would think to look. I checked in, went up to my room, and waited for Marcus to send me what I knew was coming. At 7:47 p.m., my phone buzzed. Marcus had sent a photo. Derek's car in the hotel parking lot. Time stamped. License plate visible. At 8:23 p.m., another photo. Derek walking into the hotel lobby. A blonde woman in a blue dress beside him, his hand on her lower back. At 8:31 p.m., the photo I knew would end him. Derek and the woman kissing in the elevator. His hand tangled in her hair, her sapphire necklace catching the light. I forwarded everything to Margaret. Then I did something that felt both terrifying and liberating. I opened my laptop and started drafting a business. Derek thought he'd broken me, thought he'd reduced me to nothing. What he didn't realize was that he'd just freed me to become everything I was always meant to be. I didn't hear from Derek that night. No calls, no texts. Part of me wondered if home, or if he'd stayed at the hotel with him, walking into our empty house, seeing those documents on the floor. I wished I could have seen his face. But I had more important things to focus on. Saturday morning, my phone rang at 6 a.m. It was Derek. I let it ring. He called again and again. By the 7th call, I answered. He was screaming. I had to hold the phone away from my ear. He was calling me insane, asking what I thought I was doing, demanding to know where I was, told me I'd stolen his property, that I'd broken into his accounts, that he was calling the police. I stayed calm, told him every single item I took had receipts proving I'd purchased them, reminded him that he'd received the divorce papers, so he knew exactly what I was doing. And as for his accounts, I'd accessed nothing that required a password I didn't already have. Everything was sitting in plain view on devices in our shared home. Then I told him about the photos, the hotel, the blonde woman, the necklace I'd never received. The line went dead silent. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller. He tried to explain, said it wasn't what it looked like, that she was just a coworker, that they were working on a project together, a project that required a king suite at a boutique hotel every Friday for 18 months. Sure. I told him my attorney would be in touch and hung up. Then I blocked his number. Margaret called me an hour later. Derek's attorney had already reached out. They wanted to negotiate, wanted to settle this quickly and quietly. She told me that was a good sign. It meant Derek was scared. It meant he knew how bad this looked. But I wasn't interested in quick and quiet. Not yet. Margaret had done some digging into Derek's finances, and what she'd found was even worse than I'd thought. The secret account with $63,000 wasn't the only thing he'd hidden. He'd also taken out a personal loan 6 months ago. $25,000. Never mentioned it to me, never deposited it into our joint account. She asked me if I had any idea what he'd used that money for. I didn't, but I was about to find out. That after, I met with Marcus again. He'd done more than just photograph Derek at the hotel. He'd been following him for 3 days, documenting his patterns, and he'd discovered something interesting. Derek had been visiting a condo across town. A new development, expensive area. He'd been there twice in the past week, always during work hours. Marcus had checked the property records. The condo was purchased 8 months ago under an LLC. And when he dug into the LLC, he found Derek's name buried in the paperwork. Derek had bought a second property, with money he'd hidden from me, probably planning his exit strategy for months, maybe longer. The pieces started falling into place. The cash withdrawals weren't just for hotel rooms and jewelry. He'd been building a whole separate life, a backup plan, and he was going to keep me in the dark until he was ready to leave on his terms. Or maybe he was maybe he was just planning to keep both lives going. The respectable married accountant and whatever he was doing in that condo with that woman. I felt sick. Not because I still loved him, died the moment he told me to beg, because of how calculated it all was. How long he must have been planning this. How stupid he must have thought I was. Marcus gave me the address of the condo. Then he told me something that made my hands go cold. The woman from the hotel, her name was Jessica Morris, and she worked at Derek's firm. She was his secretary. Of course she was. I went home that night, to the hotel room that was temporarily, and I couldn't stop thinking about that condo, about what was in there, about what other secrets Derek had stashed away in his perfect little backup life. Sunday morning, I made a decision. I called a friend from my old company, someone who'd stayed in touch over the years. His name was David, and he worked in corporate security now. I told him I needed a favor, something off the books. He asked what I needed. I gave him the address of Derek's condo and asked if there was any way to find out what was inside without breaking in. He said he'd see what he could do. 2 hours later, he called me back. He told me he'd reached out to a contact who worked maintenance in that building. For $200, the guy was willing to let David inspect the condo for electrical issues while the owner wasn't there. I told David I was coming with him. We went that afternoon. The maintenance guy let us in, told us we had 20 minutes, and waited in the hallway. The moment I stepped inside that condo, I understood everything. It was furnished. Designer furniture, art on the walls, a king bed with expensive linens. The closet had women's clothes. The bathroom had makeup and perfume. This wasn't a secret investment. This wasn't a backup plan. Derek had set up a whole second home for her. On the kitchen counter, I found a stack of mail, bills in the LLC's name, but being sent to this address. I took photos of everything. Then I opened the bedroom closet and found something that made my heart stop. Boxes, gift boxes, designer labels, dresses, shoes, handbags, thousands of dollars worth of gifts, all waiting to be given, all purchased with money that should have been ours. In the nightstand drawer, I found something even worse. A small velvet box. Inside was a ring. An engagement ring. Beautiful, expensive, exactly the kind of ring someone gives when they're planning a future with someone. David looked at me, his face grim. He asked if I was okay. I wasn't. But I took photos of everything anyway. The furniture, the closet, the gifts, the ring. Every single piece of evidence of the life Derek had been building while telling me I was the one living beyond our means. We left before the 20 minutes were up. I thanked David, paid him for his time and his discretion, and drove back to my hotel. That night, I sent everything to Margaret. Every photo, every discovery, the condo, the loan, the gifts, the ring. Her response came an hour late, just 3 words. We've got him. But I wasn't done, because while I was gathering evidence of Derek's betrayal, Margaret had been doing some digging of her own. And what she'd found was about to blow this whole thing wide open. Derek's firm, the one where he worked as a senior accountant, the one where Jessica was his secretary, had a very strict ethics policy. Relationships between employees, especially between supervisors and their direct reports, had to be disclosed to HR immediately. Failure to disclose could result in termination. Derek had never disclosed his relationship with Jessica, but it got better. Margaret had pulled Derek's employment contract. He'd signed a morality clause when he made senior accountant. Any behavior that could damage the firm's reputation, including undisclosed workplace relationships, financial impropriety, or fraud, was grounds for immediate dismissal without severance. And here's the thing I hadn't told you yet. The thing that was about to make all of this even sweeter. Derek's firm? They were one of the accounting firms that serviced my old company. The one I'd sold, but still owned 40% of. The one whose CEO I had on speed dial. Monday morning, I made a call. His name was Richard Chen, and we'd stayed friendly over the years. I asked if he had time for coffee, told him there was something he needed to know about one of his vendors. We met that afternoon at a cafe downtown. I showed him everything: the hidden accounts, the secret condo, the affair with a subordinate, the pattern of financial deception. Richard's face got darker with every photo I showed him. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. Then he told me something that made this whole nightmare almost worth it. My old company was in the process of preparing for an IPO. They needed their finances spotless, their vendor relationships beyond reproach. Any hint of impropriety from their accounting firm could derail months of work. Richard thanked me for bringing this to his attention. Told me he'd be making some calls that afternoon. By Tuesday morning, Derek's firm had been notified that my old company would be seeking a new accounting partner. And Derek had been invited to a meeting with HR. I didn't know what happened in that meeting. But by Tuesday afternoon, Derek's LinkedIn status had changed to open to work. The man who'd told me to beg for money was now begging for his career, and I was just getting started. By Wednesday, Derek was unraveling. I knew because Margaret told me he'd called her office 12 times in 2 days. His attorney kept trying to push for a settlement conference, kept insisting we could work this out without going to court. Margaret asked what I wanted. We wanted to drag him through every second of a public trial, wanted everyone to see what he'd done. But the smarter part of me, the part that had built a business from nothing, knew that wasn't the play. I told her to set up the conference, let him think he had a chance. But before that happened, something unexpected came into my life. Someone who would change everything about how this ended. Thursday afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I'd been getting calls from unknown numbers all week, probably Derek trying to reach me from different phones. But something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was female, young, nervous. She told me her name was Jessica Morrison. My whole body went rigid. This was her, the woman from the photos, the one wearing the necklace that should have been mine, the one living in the condo Derek had furnished with our money. She asked if we could meet, said she had something I needed to hear. Every instinct told me to hang up, to block the number, to never give this woman a single second of my time. But curiosity, or maybe it was something darker, made me say yes. We met at a coffee shop far from both of our neighborhoods. Neutral territory. I got there early, sat in the back corner where I could see the door, and waited. She walked in at exactly 2 p.m. I recognized her immediately from the photos, but she looked different in person. Smaller, tired. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hands were shaking when she ordered her coffee. She sat down across from me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she started talking, and what she told me changed everything I thought I knew about Derek's plan. Jessica said she'd been working as Derek's secretary for 3 years. He'd been kind to her at first, professional, but about 2 years ago, things changed. He started asking her to stay late, started complimenting her, started making her feel special. She was 26, fresh out of college, drowning in student loans, living paycheck to paycheck. When Derek started paying attention to her, she said it felt like someone had finally noticed her, finally saw her value. The affair started about 18 months ago. Derek told her he was in a loveless marriage, said his wife, said I, was cold and demanding, that I didn't appreciate him, that he was planning to leave me but needed to get his finances in order first. She believed him. Why wouldn't she? He was older, established, seemed to have his life together. He started helping her with her student loans. Small payments at first, $1,000 here, $1,500 there. Told her he wanted to take care of her. Then came the gifts. Dinners at expensive restaurants, the necklace, designer clothes. He rented the condo and told her it was their future. A place where they could build a life together once his divorce was finalized. She thought she was in love with, thought he was going to leave me for her. But then, last Friday night, everything fell apart. Jessica told me that Derek had shown up at their usual hotel completely unhinged. He'd been screaming about how I'd stolen his furniture, how I'd hired investigators, how I was trying to destroy his life. She said she'd never seen him like that before. Angry, panicked, almost violent. That's when she started asking real questions. About me, about our marriage, about the timeline of when he'd started. Derek's answers didn't add up. He kept contradicting himself, kept changing the story. And finally, she asked him point blank, "When were you actually planning to divorce your wife?" He'd gone quiet. And in that silence, Jessica said she realized he was planning to keep both of us, to have his stable marriage and his exciting secret life, and we'd both just keep feeding his ego. She confronted him. He got defensive. Then he made a mistake. He told her that if she caused problems, he'd make sure everyone knew she'd seduced a married man, that he'd destroy her career, that she had just as much to lose as he did. That's when Jessica understood she wasn't his future. She was just another thing he was controlling, another person he was manipulating. She'd left the hotel that night and hadn't spoken to him since. On Monday, when Derek had his meeting with HR at their firm, Jessica had been called in too. They'd asked her about the nature of her relationship with Derek. She'd told them everything: the affair, the undisclosed relationship, the gifts, the condo. Derek was fired Monday after. Jessica was given a choice: resign quietly or face potential termination for policy violations. She'd resigned Tuesday morning. Now she was sitting across from me, unemployed and humiliated, telling me she was sorry, that she'd been stupid, that she should have known better. I looked at this woman. This girl, really. And I didn't feel what I expected to feel. Derek had lied to both of us. He'd manipulated both of us. She was just another victim of his need for control. But I also wasn't about to let her off. I asked her why she was telling me all this, what she wanted from me. She pulled out her phone and slid it across. On the screen was a text thread between her and Derek. Messages going back months. Him telling her to keep their relationship secret. Him promising her a future he never intended to give her. Him instructing her on how to lie to people at work about where she was going, who she was seeing, and then the most recent messages. From the past 3 days. Derek begging her not to say anything to HR, offering her money to stay quiet, threatening her when the money didn't work. Jessica told me she'd kept every text, every email, every gift receipt. She had documentation of every lie Derek had told, every promise he'd made, every manipulation he'd used to keep her compliant. She said she wanted to give it all to me, to help my case, because if Derek had done this to both of us, he needed to face consequences. I asked her what she wanted in return. She looked me dead in the eye and said she didn't want anything except to make sure Derek never did this to anyone else again, that she wanted him to lose everything, the way she'd lost everything. I took her phone and started scrolling through the messages. It was a gold mine, proof of the affair in Derek's own words, proof of the financial manipulation, proof of his threats and his lies. I forwarded everything to my own phone, then handed hers back. Then I did something that surprised both of us. I gave her my attorney's number, told her that Margaret might be able to help her with a wrongful termination case against Derek's old firm, that just because she'd had an affair with her supervisor didn't mean the firm had handled the situation correctly. Jessica started crying, told me she didn't deserve my help after what she'd done. I told her she'd been lied to by someone who was very good at lying. That didn't make her a bad person. It made her human. We sat there for another hour. She told me more about Derek's behavior, how controlling he was, how he'd track her location, how he'd get angry if she didn't respond to his texts immediately. How he'd once grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises when she'd suggested they tell people at work about their relationship. Everything she described was the same pattern I'd seen in our marriage. The control, the manipulation, the sudden cruelty when things didn't go his way. Derek wasn't just a cheater. He was an abuser. He just hid it well enough that most people never saw it. When Jessica left, I sat in that coffee shop for a long time, staring at all the evidence she'd given me. The text messages, the emails, the documentation of every lie. I'd thought I had enough to destroy him in the divorce, but now I had something even better. I had enough to make sure everyone knew exactly who Derek really was. Friday morning, I woke up in my hotel room and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Clarity, purpose. The fog of betrayal and hurt had lifted, and what remained, focused determination. Margaret had scheduled the settlement conference for Monday, 4 days away. Derek's attorney had been pushing hard for it, probably because Derek was hemorrhaging money on legal fees while unemployed. They wanted this over with quickly. I wanted it over with too, but on my terms. I spent Friday organizing everything I had, every piece of evidence, every document, every photo. I created a timeline, cross-referenced everything, made sure there were no gaps in the story. Margaret had taught me that in litigation, the side with the better narrative usually wins. And I was about to tell the most airtight story Derek had ever heard, but there was still one piece missing. One thing that had been nagging at me since I'd discovered that secret savings account. Derek had withdrawn $63,000 in cash over 2 years. He'd bought a condo. He'd furnished it. He'd bought expensive gifts. He'd taken out a $25,000 personal loan. The math didn't add up. Even with all those expenses, there should have been more money somewhere. Derek was obsessive about finances. He wouldn't just spend everything. He'd keep a reserve, a safety net. I called Marcus one more time, asked him if he could dig deeper into Derek's financial records, bank accounts, investment accounts, anything that might be registered under his name or the LLC he'd used to buy the condo. Marcus said he'd try, but that kind of deep financial investigation took time. Time I didn't really have before Monday's conference. But sometimes luck works in your favor. Saturday afternoon, my mom called. She wanted to know how I was doing, if I needed anything before her surgery on Tuesday. I'd been so consumed with my own disaster that I'd almost forgotten she was going through something scary, too. I told her I was fine, that I'd be there for her surgery, that everything with Derek was being handled. She asked if I was sure, said I sounded tired. That's when she said something that made my heart stop. She asked if I'd gotten the papers she'd sent me last month. Said she'd mailed them to the house but never heard back from me. I had no idea what she was talking about. I asked her what papers. She explained that back in March, she'd needed to update her will. She was getting older, wanted to make sure everything was in order. Her attorney had sent her some documents about estate planning, and she'd wanted my input on a few decisions. She'd mailed copies to my house about 6 weeks ago. I'd never seen them, never even knew they existed. My mom gave me her attorney's number and told me to call him, that he could send me new copies. But I wasn't thinking about estate planning anymore. I was thinking about mail, about what else might have been sent to my house that I'd never seen. Sunday morning, I did something impulsive. I drove to the house, the one I'd emptied, the one Derek was now living in alone. I parked down the street where he wouldn't see my car and just watched for a while. Derek left around 10 a.m. I didn't know where he was going, but I waited 20 minutes to make sure he wasn't coming back. Then I walked up to the mailbox. My new key didn't work on the mailbox. That was a separate lock I hadn't thought to change. But the mailbox was overflowing. Derek clearly wasn't keeping up with mail collection. I pulled out a handful of envelopes and flyers, then quickly walked back to my car. Sitting in the driver's seat, I sorted through everything. Junk mail mostly, credit card offers, a few bills. And then I found something interesting. A statement from an investment firm I didn't recognize, addressed to Derek. I opened it. It was a brokerage account, opened 14 months ago. Current balance, $127,493. My hands were shaking as I took photos of every page. This was it. This was the missing money. Derek hadn't spent everything. He'd been investing it, building a nest egg that he thought I'd never find. But the statement showed something else too. Recent transactions. He'd withdrawn $40,000 just last week, right after I'd filed for divorce. He was hiding assets, actively trying to move money where I couldn't trace it. I sent everything to Margaret immediately, then called her. It was Sunday, but she answered anyway. When I told her what I'd found, I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. She said this changed everything. that withdrawing large sums of money during divorce proceedings was exactly the kind of behavior that courts punished severely. She asked if I could get access to more recent mail, anything that might show where that $40,000 went. I told her I'd see what I could do. Monday morning, 3 hours before our settlement conference, Marcus called me. He'd found something. Another bank account. This one opened just 8 days ago at a small credit union across the state. Opened in Derek's name with an initial deposit of $38,000. He was trying to hide money in small institutions he thought I wouldn't find, probably planning to claim poverty in the divorce. Act like he'd lost everything when I took the furniture and he lost his job. I forwarded Marcus's findings to Margaret. She called me back 2 minutes later and told me to get to her office early, that we needed to adjust our strategy for the conference. When I arrived at Margaret's office at noon, she had everything laid out on her conference table, the timeline of Derek's deceptions, the proof of his affair, the evidence of hidden assets, the threatening messages to Jessica, the new bank accounts opened during divorce proceedings. She told me that what Derek had done wasn't just betrayal. It was fraud. It was financial abuse. And it was exactly the kind of behavior that would make a judge very, very angry. The settlement conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. at a mediator's office downtown. Margaret and I arrived 15 minutes early. Derek and his attorney showed up right at 2. I hadn't seen Derek in person since the night he'd told me to beg. He looked terrible. He'd lost weight. His suit was wrinkled. There were dark circles under his eyes that matched the ones I'd seen on Jessica. But when he saw me, something flickered in his expression. He tried to smile, tried to look confident, like he still thought he had some control over this situation. He had no idea what was about to hit him. We sat down on opposite sides of the mediator's table. The mediator introduced himself, explained the process, asked each side to present their opening position. Derek's attorney went first. He painted a picture of a difficult marriage, mutual problems, suggested a straightforward division of marital assets, and a clean break. He mentioned that Derek had recently experienced job loss through no fault of his own, and requested that any spousal support considerations take his current financial hardship into account. Then it was Margaret's turn. She opened her folder and pulled out the first document, the bank statement showing Derek's secret savings account. She slid it across the table. Then the second document, the loan application for $25,000 never disclosed. Then the third, the LLC paperwork for the condo purchase. Then the photos, the hotel confirmations, the text messages with Jessica, the gifts, the engagement ring, then the final piece, the brokerage statement with the $40,000 withdrawal and the credit union account opened 8 days ago. Margaret laid it all out methodically, like she was teaching a class. Each piece of evidence built on the last, creating an undeniable narrative of deception, manipulation, and fraud. Derek's face went from confident to confused to horrified in the span of about 5 minutes. His attorney kept looking at him with this expression that said, "Why didn't you tell me about any of this?" When Margaret finished, the room was completely silent. Then the mediator cleared his throat and asked Derek if he had any response to these allegations. Derek tried. He really did. He said the savings account was for emergencies, that the condo was an investment property, that his relationship with Jessica was complicated but didn't affect the divorce, that the recent bank account was just him reorganizing his finances. Every word sounded hollow, desperate. Margaret let him finish. Then she pulled out one more document, one I hadn't seen before. It was a forensic accounting. She'd hired an expert who traced every dollar of Derek's hidden money, every withdrawal, every transfer, every lie. The report showed that Derek had systematically diverted over $200,000 of marital assets over the past 2.5 years. Money that should have been in our joint accounts. Money he'd hidden, spent on his affair, invested in secret accounts, and was now trying to claim didn't exist. Margaret looked directly at Derek's attorney and said she had a counteroffer for settlement. Derek would return every single dollar of hidden marital assets, plus pay a $50,000 penalty for fraudulent dissipation. He would waive any claim to my separate business assets. He would cover all of my legal fees. And he would sign a non-disparagement agreement preventing him from ever speaking publicly about our marriage or the divorce. If he refused, Margaret would file a motion for sanctions with the court, report his behavior to the State Bar Association for possible criminal fraud charges, and ensure that every detail of his affair and financial abuse became part of public record. Derek's attorney asked for a recess. They went into a private room for 30 minutes. When they came back, Derek looked like he'd aged 10 years. His attorney told us they'd accept the terms Just like that, it was over. Derek signed the settlement agreement right there at the table. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely write his name. I walked out of that conference room with everything I'd wanted, everything I'd fought for. But more than that, I walked out knowing that Derek would never be able to do this to anyone else, that his pattern of abuse was on record, that he'd face consequences. As I stood outside on the courthouse steps with breathing in the cool autumn air, I realized something. I hadn't just won a divorce settlement, I'd reclaimed myself. The woman I'd been before Derek made me small, before he made me doubt my own worth. That woman was never going to disappear again. The settlement was signed on Monday. By Tuesday morning, the money started hitting my account. Derek had 7 days to transfer all hidden assets back into a joint account that would then be divided according to the agreement. Margaret assured me he'd comply. Men like Derek were terrified of public exposure, and we'd made it very clear what would happen if he didn't follow through. Tuesday was also my mom's surgery day. I'd promised her I'd be there, and I wasn't going to let Derek's mess take that away from her, too. I sat in the hospital waiting room for 4 hours while the surgeons worked. My phone kept buzzing with notifications. Bank transfers starting to come through, emails from Margaret's office, a text from Marcus confirming he'd closed out my case. But I ignored all of it. For those 4 hours, I just focused on being a daughter, on being present for someone who'd always been present for me. The surgery went well. When they finally let me see her in recovery, my mom looked small and pale against the white hospital sheets, but she smiled when she saw me, asked how I was holding up with everything. I told her the truth, that it had been the hardest few weeks of my life, but that I'd come out the other side stronger, that Derek was out of my life, that I was going to be okay. She squeezed my hand and told me she'd always known I was stronger than I thought, that she'd worried sometimes during my marriage that I'd lost that strength, but she was glad to see it back. Her words stayed with me as I drove home that evening, not to the hotel anymore, but to a beautiful apartment I'd signed a lease on that morning. It was in a high-rise downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city skyline. It was mine, just mine, felt like freedom. But even as I was rebuilding my life, I couldn't stop thinking about something that had been bothering me since the settlement conference. Derek had complied too easily. He'd signed those papers without much of a fight. For someone who'd spent years controlling every aspect of his life and mine, he'd given up awfully fast. It didn't sit right with Wednesday afternoon. I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Jessica again. She sounded panicked, said she needed to see me right away, that something had happened. We met at the same coffee shop as before. She looked worse than she had the first time, exhausted, scared. She sat down across from me and immediately pulled out her phone. She told me that Derek had been calling her. A lot. Ever since the settlement conference on Monday, he'd been leaving her voicemails, sending her texts, even showing up at her apartment. He was desperate, she said. Unraveling. At first, he'd tried to blame her, said she'd ruined his life by talking to HR, by giving me evidence, told her she was a liar and a traitor. But then his messages changed. He started begging her to help him, said he needed her to testify that their relationship had been consensual and mutual, that I'd manipulated the narrative to make him look like a predator. He offered her money, $20,000, if she'd sign an affidavit saying I'd coerced her into giving false testimony. Jessica had refused, told him to leave her alone, or she'd file a restraining order. That's when Derek made a threat. He told her that if she didn't help him, he'd make sure everyone knew she'd seduced a married man to get ahead at work, that he'd ruin her reputation in the industry so she'd never work in corporate America again. Jessica played me the voicemail. Derek's voice was cold, calculated. This wasn't a desperate man. This was a man who'd realized he'd lost control and was trying to take back whatever power he could. But Jessica had something Derek didn't know about, something she'd been holding onto since their relationship ended. She pulled out a small recording device, the kind that looks like a regular pen. She told me that about 6 months ago, Derek's behavior had started scaring her. The way he'd get angry, the way he'd make threats when things didn't go his way. So she'd started recording their conversations, just in case she ever needed proof of what he was really like. She had hours of recordings. Derek talking about how he'd never leave me because divorce was too expensive. Derek discussing how he'd hidden money from both of us. Derek describing in detail how he'd manipulated situations at work to keep Jessica dependent on him. And then, the recording that changed everything. Jessica played it for me. It was from about 3 months ago, recorded in Derek's car. I could hear Derek's voice clearly. He was talking about his long-term plan, how he'd keep me in the dark about his finances, gradually move more money into hidden accounts, and then eventually file for divorce on his terms when he'd secured enough assets. He talked about how easy it was to manipulate me to him, laughed about how I had no idea what was really going on. He said something that made my blood run cold. He talked about his job at the accounting firm and how he'd been cooking the books for one of their smaller clients, overcharging them, pocketing the difference. Said it was easy money, that the client was too stupid to notice. Derek wasn't just a cheater and a liar. He was committing fraud. Professional, criminal fraud. I looked at Jessica, my mind racing. This recording was evidence of a crime. If this got out, Derek wouldn't just lose money in a divorce settlement. He could face criminal charges, lose his CPA license permanently, maybe even go to jail. Jessica asked me what she should do, said she was terrified Derek would follow through on his threats, but she also didn't want to be responsible for sending someone to prison. I told her that Derek had made his own choices, that he'd committed crimes, abused people, destroyed lives, that protecting him now would only allow him to do it again to someone else. Then I did something I'd been putting off. I called Richard Chen, the CEO of my old company, the one Derek's firm had been servicing before they lost the contract because of Derek's behavior. I asked Richard if his company had ever done business with a client named, I checked the recording notes Jessica had made, Hartwell Manufacturing. There was a pause on the line. Then Richard told me that yes, Hartwell Manufacturing was one of their subsidiary companies, a small operation they'd acquired 2 years ago, and Derek had been their account manager. I told Richard he needed to hear something, sent him the recording Jessica had made. 20 minutes later, Richard called me back. His voice was tight, controlled anger. He told me that he'd be contacting their legal team immediately, that they'd be launching an internal investigation into Derek's handling of the Hartwell account, that if the recording was accurate, they'd be pressing charges. I thanked him and hung up. Then I turned to Jessica and told her she needed to make a formal report to the police, that she had evidence of a crime and withholding it could make her complicit. She was scared. I understood that. But I also told her something I'd learned over the past few weeks. The only way to stop men like Derek was to make sure they faced real consequences. Not just financial, not just professional, real legal consequences that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Jessica agreed. We went to the police station together that afternoon. She gave them the recording device, made a formal statement, and filed a report about Derek's threats and harassment. The detective who took her statement told us that the fraud allegations would be investigated, but that these things took time. Financial crimes were complicated, required forensic accounting, witness testimony, a whole process. But he also told us that the harassment and threats Jessica had documented were enough for an immediate restraining order. He helped her file the paperwork right there. By Thursday morning, Derek had been served with a restraining order. By Thursday afternoon, the state licensing board for CPAs had been notified of the fraud allegations. By Thursday evening, Richard's company had filed a formal complaint with the district attorney's office. Derek's carefully constructed life was coming apart at the seams, and this time, there was no settlement he could sign to make it go away. Friday morning, I woke up to a text from Margaret. She'd heard about the criminal investigation. News traveled fast in legal circles. She told me I should prepare myself, that Derek might try to blame me somehow, claim I'd orchestrated everything out of revenge. I told her I wasn't worried, that the truth had a way of speaking for itself, that I had nothing to hide. That afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Derek's mother. I hadn't spoken to her since before the separation. She'd always been kind to me, but distant. The type of mother-in-law who stayed out of her son's marriage. She was crying. Told me she'd just found out about everything. The divorce, the affair, the hidden money, now the criminal investigation. Said she couldn't believe her son had done these things, that she'd raised him better than that. Part of me wanted to hang up, to tell her that her son's choices weren't my problem anymore. But another part of me, the part that still remembered family dinners and holiday gatherings, felt sorry for her. She asked me if the allegations were true, if Derek had really done everything people were saying. I told her yes, all of it, and probably more that we hadn't discovered yet. There was a long silence. Then she told me something that made everything click into place. She said Derek's father had been the same way, charming on the surface, controlling underneath, that he'd hidden money, had affairs, manipulated everyone around him, that she'd stayed with him for 40 years before he finally died, and she'd spent every one of those years feeling small and powerless. She said she'd seen the signs in Derek, had worried he was becoming like his father, but she'd told herself it was different, that Derek had learned from his father's mistake. She'd been wrong. I told her I was sorry, for her and for whatever pain she was feeling, but that Derek's behavior wasn't something I could fix or forgive. That the consequences he was facing now were of his own making. She understood, told me she didn't blame me, that she was actually proud of me for standing up for myself in a way she never had. We talked for almost an hour about marriage, about control, about how easy it is to lose yourself in someone else's narrative of who you should be. When we hung up, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd closed a door I hadn't even realized was still open. That evening, I stood in my new apartment looking out at the city lights, and I realized something. Derek had thought he was punishing me when he cut off my credit cards, thought he was putting me in my place. But what he'd actually done was set me free. Free to see who he really was. Free to reclaim the power I'd always had. Free to build a life that was entirely my own. The legal process would take months, maybe years. Derek would face trial for the fraud charges, would lose his CPA license, would probably lose everything he'd worked so hard to hide. It wasn't my concern anymore. My concern was moving forward, building something new, making sure that other women didn't fall into the same trap I had. And I had a plan for that. A plan that was about to become my new beginning. 6 months have passed since that Tuesday in the supermarket when my card was declined. 6 months since Derek told me to beg. 6 months since I opened my laptop and discovered I'd never needed him at all. A lot has happened since then. Derek was formally charged with wire fraud and embezzlement 3 months ago. The investigation into his handling of the Hartwell manufacturing account uncovered over $300,000 in fraudulent billing over 18 months. He pled guilty last month to avoid trial. Sentencing is next week, but his attorney has already told him to expect at least 3 years in federal prison. His CPA license was revoked. His name is now on a state registry of individuals prohibited from handling financial accounts. Even after he serves his time, he'll never work in accounting again. The divorce was finalized 2 months ago. I got every dollar we'd agreed to in the settlement, plus additional damages once the criminal fraud came to light. Derek's assets were seized to pay restitution to his victims, but there was enough left over to cover what he owed me. Jessica moved to a different state, got a job at a nonprofit doing administrative work. She checks in with me every few weeks, and she sounds happier now, lighter. She's in therapy, working through the trauma of what Derek did to her. She told me last month that meeting me was the thing that saved her, that seeing another woman refuse to be broken by him gave her permission to do the same. My mom recovered fully from her surgery. She's doing great, actually. I see her twice a week now. We have lunch, talk about everything and nothing. She tells me I'm different than I was a year ago. Stronger, more myself. I tell her she's right, but the biggest change isn't any of that. The biggest change is what I built from the ashes of my marriage. Remember how I told you I'd started my own investment advisory firm when I was 24? How I'd sold it but kept 40% of the shares? Well, my non-compete expired and I was free to start something new. So I did. 3 months ago, I opened my new company. It's called Beg for It Financial Advisory. Yes, I named it after the words Derek said to me that day. Because those words, meant to humiliate me, to make me small, became the catalyst for everything that followed. But this isn't just an investment firm. It's a financial planning and asset protection company specifically for women. Women who are thinking about getting married and want to protect their assets. Women who are already married and worried about financial abuse. Women going through divorce and don't know how to untangle their finances from a controlling partner. We help them understand their financial power, show them how to keep separate accounts, how to document their contributions, how to recognize the warning signs of financial manipulation. We connect them with attorneys, therapists, investigators when needed. We give them the tools to protect themselves before things get as bad as they did for me. The response has been overwhelming. In 3 months, we've signed 60 clients. I've hired 5 employees, all women who've experienced financial abuse themselves and wanted to turn that pain into purpose. We're opening a second office next month in a different city. Last week, I was invited to speak at a women's business conference about financial independence and asset protection in marriage. 200 women showed up. After my talk, at least 30 of them waited in line to tell me their stories. Stories just like mine. Husbands who controlled the bank accounts, partners who hid money, men who used finances as a weapon. Every single one of them asked the same question. How did you find the courage to fight back? And I told them the truth. I didn't find courage. I found anger. I found clarity. I found the part of myself I'd buried to make my marriage work, and I realized that part of me was more valuable than any relationship that required me to stay small. Derek thought money was power, thought that by controlling our finances, he controlled me. What he didn't understand was that real power doesn't come from what you have in the bank. It comes from knowing your own worth, from refusing to accept less than you deserve, from building something meaningful from the rubble of what broke you. My life now looks nothing like it did 6 months ago. I live in an apartment I chose, furnished with things I picked out. I drive a car I bought myself. Every morning, I wake up and make decisions based on what I want, not what someone else expects of me. And yeah, I think about Derek sometimes. I wonder if he has moments in whatever cell he realizes how badly he miscalculated. If he understands that the woman's the same woman who built a business empire before she... I don't think about him at all. Because he doesn't deserve space in my... He had 5 years. He doesn't get another second. Last week, I did something I'd been planning since the day I signed my first client. I wrote a check for $50,000 to a women's shelter that helps victims of domestic abuse. The organization provides financial literacy classes, job training, legal assistance, all the things women need to rebuild their lives after leaving abusive situations. When I delivered the check, the director asked me why I chose their organization. I told her that financial abuse is domestic abuse, that it leaves scars just as deep as physical violence, that women deserve to know they can survive and thrive after leaving, that there's a whole life waiting for them on the other side of fear. She asked if I wanted my donation to be anonymous. I told her no. I wanted my name on it, Rachel Montgomery, the woman who was told to beg and who built an empire instead. So that's my story. That's how a declined credit card in a supermarket checkout line became the best thing that ever happened to me. If you're watching this and you're in a relationship where someone controls your money, questions every purchase, makes you feel guilty for spending, hides assets, or threatens to cut you off, please know this: you deserve better. You are worth more. And there are people who will help you. You don't have to beg for anything. Not for money, not for respect, not for basic human dignity. Those things are your right. And anyone who tries to take them from you doesn't deserve a place in your life. Derek thought he was teaching me a lesson that day. He was right. Just not the lesson. He taught me that I was never the fragile, dependent woman he tried to make me believe I was. That the strength I'd used to build my first company was still there, waiting to be remembered. That sometimes the worst thing that happened is also the thing that saved. I started this story by telling you that my husband cut off my credit card and told me to beg for it. What I learned is that I didn't need to beg. I didn't need him. I didn't need anyone's permission to be powerful. I already was powerful. I'd just forgotten for a while. Now, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure other women remember their power too. Before I go, I want to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments. I love knowing this message is reaching women all over the world. We're stronger together, and your story matters just as much as mine. And if you want to follow more stories like this, stories about women who refused to stay down, who fought back and won, hit that subscribe button. Because the world is full of women who were underestimated, and every single one of them has a story worth hearing. Thank you for listening to mine. Thank you for being here for every chapter of this journey. Now go out there and remember your power. The world is waiting for what you're going to build next.